Hello, and welcome to the third of these quick Q&A for Dynamic Range Day live streams. Hopefully you guys can see and hear me okay today. I've still been having problems with the video quality at this end all the time. It doesn't seem to be my connection. It's something to do with the interface with the servers. So I am now in the slightly unusual situation of streaming via my phone's data connection. So hopefully the picture quality is better for you guys. If it drops down at any point, then I apologize. So we've got quite a few questions to get through today. So we'll get started right momentarily. But before I do, please take a minute to share this video with, or this post, wherever it is you're watching it, whether it's on YouTube, whether it's on Facebook, with people that you know, your connections, who you think might also find it useful or interesting. These quick Q&As have been for Dynamic Range Day, which is tomorrow, Friday, the 27th of March. It's an online event to raise awareness of the issue of the loudness wars, this trend over the years for music to get louder and louder and more crushed. And unfortunately, it doesn't sound as good when that happens. It's particularly unnecessary these days when most people listen to music online, especially for the first time, when first impressions count, and the loud stuff is turned down. So you could kind of say that it's a fairly fruitless exercise. So yeah, please share this content, spread the word, tell people. I've sunk quite a lot of time into troubleshooting the video connections because it's important for the webcasts tomorrow. So I've got a few memes that I'm planning to share soon. Hopefully I'll get some of those out maybe this evening, but certainly tomorrow. There's a ton of content on the Dynamic Range Day website that you guys can share. It'd be really good fun if you did. I can see loads of people here. Martin is here. Bob, hi. Oh, good. Much better quality. Says, Viola Moonshape. That is a fabulous name, Viola. I have no idea whether that's your actual name or not, but it's fabulous either way. Tom Smith, great to see you all. Okay, so I'm going to start with, I apologize, I can't remember who asked this question. I saw it yesterday and I thought it'd be worth answering. I don't remember the name of the person who asked it, and it kind of feeds into a question that Tom C asked. So the initial question was, what is dynamic range? And then Tom asked or said, some loudness meters have a dynamic range indicator. Is there a dynamic range to shoot for? So lots of people talk about dynamic range. There's the TT dynamic range meter that lots of people have heard of. This is Dynamic Range Day. There is the dynamic range database. Dynamic range is tricky because basically dynamic range is the difference between the loudest and the quietest thing, or in terms of images, it's the brightest and the darkest thing. However, in music, so in strictly terms with music, you're talking about, you know, if you've got 0 at the top of the digital scale and minus 96 at the bottom of the scale for 16-bit audio, then the dynamic range there is 96 dBs. But we often talk about the dynamic range of the music, meaning the range that the music takes up. And that means probably you're talking about more like 60 dBs, the difference between the hiss from maybe the tape or the mic noise or whatever, and the peak level that you can have. But even then, the music probably, even with something really dynamic like orchestral classical music, for example, probably the quieter sections are maybe minus 40, minus 30 dB. So the dynamic range there is 30 or 40 dBs. Most pop music has a difference in dynamic range between the verse and the chorus, for example, of only about 4 or 5 dBs. So I think the most useful number to consider when you're talking about, I guess what I'm saying is there are lots of different ways of defining dynamic range depending on the usage. Strictly speaking, in an electrical sense, it's 96 dBs for 16-bit audio. So, but that's kind of not that helpful. It's more useful to talk about the music, and I think it's more important to talk about the difference between the peak level, which are the 0 at the top that your DAW shows, and the short-term loudness, which is more or less equivalent to the RMS or the VU level if you measure those things. And I've talked about both of those things in the previous 2 Q&A sessions. That gives you something that is more or less known as the Crest Factor. There's the trouble with a lot of this stuff is there are very precise technical definitions for a lot of these things that we talk about, and they're not always applied strictly when we talk about audio, but it's very helpful to think about the Crest Factor, the difference, the amount of space excuse me, between the short-term loudness, the kind of the loudness that we perceive when we listen, and the peak level, which is the maximum that can be stored in the format. And in my experience, that's not the dynamic range. The TT dynamic range meter measures something similar to that. It's the difference between the peak and the RMS level. It's not really dynamic range. And, you know, strictly speaking, this shouldn't be dynamic range day, or tomorrow shouldn't be dynamic range day, because with 16-bit audio, we're fine. We've got a dynamic range of 96 dBs, but we're talking about the dynamic range of the music, the contrast between the loudest and the softest parts, and also the amount of space that the peaks have to do their work. How high is the average level pushed up against that 0 dB ceiling that all digital formats have? Because the vast majority of us are listening to digital audio these days. And for me, the golden number is 8. If you have 8 dBs difference between the peak level and the short-term loudness, you're probably okay. Depends exactly what the signal is, depends what the material is, it depends on your musical intentions. But for me, once it gets going below, once it goes below that, then that's when you get into trouble. I mentioned this in previous webcasts as well, but that's the short-term loudness, and that I'm talking about the loudest moments. So the most intense moments of your songs, if you've got 8 dBs, so just if you're using an LUFS meter, a loudness units meter, and you have, as I recommend, the peak level set at -1 to get or to try and ensure decent quality when it's streamed or ripped for portable, you know, media devices, iPods and MP3 players and stuff, then you could have the loudness at -9. The difference then would be -1 peak, -9 short-term loudness. You've got 8 dBs difference. You're probably okay. Now, if the song is loud all the way through, then the overall level, you've got an overall value for that. Well, the peak to loudness ratio is what we call it. That's a technical term for it. And the overall PLR, peak to loudness ratio, could be as low as 8 or 9 dBs. I would argue I'm more comfortable with 10 personally, but you know, it's all down to taste to a degree. However, if it's not loud all the way through, if there's more variety, if the song has quiet verses and louder choruses, or a quieter introduction that builds up, you know, if it's like Stairway to Heaven where it just gets louder all the way through, say, then the overall value is not going to be as low as it was at that loudest point. At the loudest bit, you've only got these 8 dBs of difference between the peak and the short-term loudness, but everywhere else you've probably got more. So you take that overall value and the PLR, that overall value will come out as lower. So, you know, typically for stuff that I'm working on, I'm seeing values of 12, 14, 16 for quieter songs. So none of these things are targets, right? It all depends on the music. It depends on your goals and all the rest of it. But those are kind of ideas of how I assess these things and what I kind of shoot for. And in fact, the plugin that I developed with Meter Plugs that I announced on Dynamic Range Day a few years back, Dynameter, shows you a real-time graph of that. So you can, like the TT meter, but you see this evolving graph over time. It's color-coded, so you can see when the peak to short-term loudness ratio gets too low. It goes red, and you know that maybe you need to be listening carefully in case you're not happy with the results. And you can use it to display the overall picture or view of a song, just to get a kind of at-a-glance idea of the amount of variety that there is in the song, and also how loud it is. That's super helpful, but you can also do it with just a standard peak level meter and an LUFS meter, or an RMS meter, in fact, as well, if you want to keep an eye on that. And as I mentioned in previous webcasts, for me, the golden rule is no louder than -10 LUFS at the loudest sections. If you think about that, peak -1, short-term loudness -10, that's actually 9 dBs. That's you're giving yourself a dB to err on the side of caution. You can go higher than that. You can master with more dynamics, of course, but people always want to know from me, how far would you push it? And that's the answer for me. Now, there's lots of mainstream music out there that is pushed much louder. You're down to, you get overall values of 8 or 7 for a song. And I had a question from someone Oh, so Viola, hopefully that answers your question, because you were asking, we suggest we master, so there's an 8 to a 9 dB difference between the two loudness measurements. Which two measurements are those? So it's the sample peak. I recommend you keep at -1. True peak might go a little bit higher, but hopefully that's around -1 as well. And then the short-term loudness. At the loudest moments, keep the difference between them, or the PSR, the peak to short-term loudness ratio, 8 or above, and hopefully you should be in good shape. So hopefully that answers some questions. Yeah, lots of people kind of asking about commercial releases, and so, reference tracks saying, well, this big hit or that big hit, when I measure it, the integrated loudness is -7 or -6 or even higher. They sound okay to me. So isn't it okay to go to those values? And I guess in one sense, the answer to that is yes, if they sound okay to you. The trick is that we never hear, or we rarely hear both. And that's the great thing about, well, back in the day, Death Magnetic was was an extreme example where people had never heard that contrast before between something that was kind of insanely loud and another version of it that wasn't insanely loud, and could make their own minds up. But there have been other examples over the years, and my favorite at the moment is Dirty Computer by Janelle Monáe. It was released last year sometime, because you can compare the CD or the iTunes version of that with there's a version of the album on YouTube where you can hear the whole thing, and the YouTube version has more dynamics. It's about 3 dBs. It's not kind of an enormous amount, but so the YouTube version is about at the maximum loudness that I personally am comfortable mastering at. It's the kind of point where if people want to go louder, I say, you probably find somebody else to get you a better result. I just don't enjoy that kind of work. Anyone can do it. All the digital tools we have these days, I say anyone, it's possible for anyone to achieve those loudness levels. Getting it to sound halfway decent is another matter, but I just don't find it satisfying. So that's the level that YouTube clip is at, or that YouTube version of the album. When you listen to the CD, it's about 3 dBs louder than that, and it just feels held in to me. It just feels like it's in a box, and that's what I think would happen if you were able to do this comparison with all those other albums. If you took all those other releases that, they're -7, -8 LUFS overall, they sound, in lots of ways, they sound good. But if we could compare it, in my opinion, with a version that was just a little bit less heavily processed, I think they would sound even better. That's always been my experience when I'm working. I said yesterday, sometimes clients encourage me to go more dynamic, and I explain to them the pros and cons about all of that, and then we do the experiment, and everybody loves the result. And so it's definitely an experiment I would encourage you to do as well. And I think that's a great way to talk about it, by the way. Lots of people listen to the things I have to say on Dynamic Range Day and just say, I can't say that to my clients. If I say this is too loud, you should be mastering it quiet, I'm just going to piss them off. They're going to go and work with somebody else. And of course I understand that, but I think if we talk about experiments, I think you take what you have and say, okay, here's what I've done. I think it sounds great, but I'd love to try the experiment. I'd love to see whether we can make it sound even better by working from a mix that was less crushed or whatever. That doesn't, in my experience, upset people. Sometimes the answer is no, but often the answer is yes. And always when I do that, I have been able to get a better result. So I'm just going to pause at this point and take a look at some of the questions coming in on the live stream. Okay, some people saying that YouTube is down. If so, please try Facebook. Hope that's not the case. Let me just check. I'm going to pause the broadcast if we're not working on YouTube. Let's take a look. Okay, I'm just going to try restarting this here before I go any further. The screen will go black for a minute. If you can see me, don't panic. I'll be back, hopefully. Let's see what happens. Okay, I'm just refreshing the YouTube stream to see if that helps. Fingers crossed. No, looks like the YouTube stream is down, so I hope you guys, I'm going to check Facebook now. So I hope you guys, I'm going to check Facebook now. Okay, YouTube is up, so I'm going to keep going and hope that I can get an archive of this for the to post on Facebook. Let me just post a comment here. If you've lost me on YouTube, try Facebook. Okay, you guys are picking up on that, so we will keep going. I can't even post to YouTube. Okay. Just scrolling back through the questions here. Okay, so Ashley Martinez, I hope I pronounced that vaguely right, says, hi, I'm releasing a song on April the 3rd. The mastering engineer gave me a couple of files. One was called Spotify -14 LUFS, so I went with that one. Now I'm concerned it might be too quiet because after dropping it on the loudness penalty analyzer, it displayed plus 1.8 dB. On the other hand, the standard master displayed minus 4.4 dB. What concerns me is if it would have been better submit the loud one, or if the one I submitted will really be lifted to match the other music out there, especially on Spotify and Apple. Should I be worried? Okay, so there's a few things to unpack there. The first one thing, I think the first thing to say is there's no need to supply a master at -14 just because Spotify and YouTube and wherever are using -14. This is the first thing that I said on the first one of these Q&As. The -14 figure is the reference level that those streaming services use, and they just turn loud stuff down to that level. We can supply whatever we like. Now, I don't recommend, obviously, you supply something super loud, but if it's being turned down by 2 dB, maybe even 3 dB, and it's a loud song, I'm perfectly comfortable with that. It's, you know, that's not going to affect the quality or anything else. And if it sounds great, it is great. So having said that, there's no harm in submitting something that is at -14 or using that if you want to. The thing to be aware of is that Spotify in particular is not using LUFS. And I suspect actually what you're seeing there is a song where the -14 LUFS figure is correct, but Spotify has a different opinion about how loud it is. Spotify uses replay gain, not LUFS. There are two different ways of assessing the loudness. So if Spotify disagrees with YouTube, you're going to get a result that you're not necessarily, or that is different than you might expect. So I imagine that song says nothing for YouTube, meaning it won't be changed, and probably Tidal and Amazon Music as well, but Spotify is showing that the level will be lifted. Now, in terms of people hearing it louder, you don't have to worry because YouTube, Tidal, Amazon Music, none of the others actually lift quiet songs up. But if this song is at -14, they're going to be happy with it as is. Spotify is the only one that does lift things up. Sorry, correct myself. Spotify and iTunes lift things up. iTunes has a lower reference level, so that's going to be fine. Spotify has, excuse me, a limiter to rule out the possibility of clipping when the level is lifted. So if that value is correct and your song is being lifted by 1.8 dBs on Spotify, the loudness will sound fine in comparison to the other material. Won't sound significantly different than the louder version you had. However, you may hear their limiter working sometimes, and it's not a very subtle or sophisticated limiter, unfortunately. So that's the only disadvantage. I mean, the good news is you can replace the version on Spotify. So you could ask your engineer for something that splits the difference. Because I have to say, I mean, being turned down by 4.4 dB, which you said was the original louder master, that's a bit, I think that's a bit far. That's probably -3 is the biggest reduction that I personally feel comfortable with. And that's just because that's what I get for the stuff that I master at the levels that I like. So there is a degree of taste involved in that, but I'm mastering stuff so that the short-term loudness and the peak have at least 8-9 dBs between them at the loudest moments, as I explained at the beginning of this webcast. And when I do, I see the loudest stuff I master, the louder tracks, the ones that are loud all the way through, getting turned down by about 3 dBs. So I'm comfortable with that. It's just a number at the end of the day. When I start to see 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dBs of reduction on these streaming services, that's when I start to feel like, well, maybe that's a missed opportunity. That's when I want to do the experiment. If I pushed it less hard, how would it sound? Would it sound any different? Would it sound better? And in my experience, it always ends up sounding at least as good and probably better. And it's, it's hard to achieve super loud results. And if you don't have to, why put in all that time and effort? Let's put our creative energies in other more profitable directions. So you're probably fine, but it might be interesting to ask the mastering engineers, can he do one that's a couple of dBs louder than the current Spotify version? That's going to come out probably, I guess, at minus kind of 12-ish LUFS. So YouTube will turn it down by a dB or 2. No big deal. Spotify won't have to adjust the level, so you won't have run the risk of hitting Spotify's limiter. It could well be fine. It maybe only hits it on 2 or 3 occasions in the entire song, and when it does, you can't hear it. So another way to say this is listen to it on Spotify. If you're comfortable with the way that it sounds, you're good. But yeah, that's a fairly complicated example, but hopefully you guys could follow what I was talking about there. That's why we made the Loudness Penalty website, loudnesspenalty.com, so that you can find out what the streaming services are going to do, how those numbers vary between the services, and you can preview it and compare it with other similar material. Because the truth is probably that quieter version that the mastering engineer supplied you with just has less limiting. Limiting tends to be pretty transparent if it's been well done. So once you've loudness matched those two versions, you probably hear only a very small difference, perhaps at the loudest moments. It's hard to say without hearing the material. But maybe you're going to, like that Janelle Monáe example, there's going to be a real overall benefit. Maybe the sound will be able to relax and breathe a little bit more and have more space and clarity and excitement and be more involving as a result. And that's the advantage, that's the benefit we can get from dynamics that is so valuable and so worthwhile. And I always want to hear. And that's the message of Dynamic Range Day. That's, it's not don't master your music loud, don't add distortion, don't use compression, don't use limiting. None of those things matter to me. It's just a question of don't make your stuff -6 LUFS because artist XYZ did it. Don't feel you have to make your music -6 LUFS in order to compete or to sell tons of copies, because the research shows that people don't care. They're concerned about the music. They want to love the music, and they will put up with almost anything in terms of sound. They won't care about the loudness, particularly not online, because most stuff is mastered loud enough that it gets turned down a little bit and everything sounds similar. It's all fine. What this means is we've got freedom, we've got opportunity. We can just forget about all this stuff that's 10, 15, 20 years that we've been going through all of this, and we can just do what's right for the music. We'll make the music sound the best it can be. If the streaming services want to adjust the levels, well, we let them. We can preview it and check that we're happy with the results, and then set the music free and let everybody enjoy it for what it is. That's the goal. That's the message of Dynamic Range Day, is to be aware, stop worrying, and love the dynamics. Maybe that's a new slogan for the event. So there you go. That's about 25 minutes. I need to head off at this point, but thank you so much for putting up with the technical issues. I'm sorry if you're watching this on YouTube and it fell over for you, but hopefully the replay will be usable. Clearly we have some internet issues because of the current such heavy usage at the moment. Hopefully those won't be a problem tomorrow for Dynamic Range Day. I'm hoping to do a couple of live streams during the day, and then of course the webcast in the evening, where I will present the award for best sounding dynamic album of the last 12-ish months. I'm also hoping to have some guests that I think you guys will recognize and find what they have to say very interesting. And throughout the day, of course, we'll be sharing nonsense about this topic and trying to spread the word further. So again, please like, subscribe, share this content so that as many people as possible can find out about the day tomorrow. And if you're able to, it'd be great if you can get involved. Hopefully I will see you then. Thanks for listening.